día. Muchísimas gracias por permitirme tener el honor de estar aquí con ustedes.
Good morning. Thank you very much for allowing me to have the honor of being here with you and for being able to transmit to you some of the ideas that are very important.
Muy importantes en lo que tiene que ver con
In what has to do with the government that we are leading in Argentina.
acá en Argentina. Naturalmente,
Naturally, I never stop being an economist, and there are issues that become super important.
Importante, sobre todo en lo que tiene que ver con la toma de decisiones.
Especially in what has to do with decision making, and in today's talk, I want to focus on one of the topics that I develop in my recent book, entitled Capitalism.
Capitalismo, socialismo y la trampa neoclásica.
Socialism and the neoclassical trap. Basically, I want to go over what, technically, is called a market failure, which is defined as non-convexity, that is, when there are concentrated market structures, and how regulation ends up killing innovation and economic growth. In that sense, basically, the talk is going to be structured in 5 parts. The first thing I am going to do is to present the logic of the conceptual structure of what I am going to be presenting. Which are the driving elements that are behind the argument, and obviously once I do this, I am going to begin to elaborate where I consider that the neoclassical structure has a problem, a failure, an error, and that this leads to state intervention, and that is what ends up killing economic growth. Basically, the first element of the conceptual structure is an idea of Mises, who pointed out that there were only 2 polar economic systems. On the one hand, free enterprise capitalism, and on the other extreme, real socialism. That idea, combined with a very famous work by Hayek, which is the book, The Road to Serfdom, which pointed out that every time there was a state intervention, the result ended up being worse than what there was originally. There is a phrase by Milton Friedman, who spent a lot of time here at the Hoover Institute, which said that, in general, the correction of a market failure by the state ends up being worse than what we had originally, and basically, then, what Hayek pointed out in The Road to Serfdom is that every time there was an intervention, the result was worse, and that motivated politicians to new interventions, and that caused not only the system to function worse, but it implied an ever greater weight of the state, and that this dynamic ultimately led to socialism and therefore led to misery. Therefore, it is important to know what are the logics and the dynamics that also lead to that. The first point that has to do with the impossibility of socialism was already raised in 1922 by Mises in his book, Socialism, and what he said was that socialism was unviable because it could not make economic calculations. That is to say, specifically, if what one is doing in a transaction is exchanging property rights, and that is what generates a historical record called prices, and that works as a signal transmission mechanism, where agents coordinate, some will be buyers, others will be sellers, and that in the face of the existence of divergences there will be adjustments, that is to say, The price system is a mechanism for transmitting information for coordination and adjustment. So, the central event is triggered by the exchange of property rights. Therefore, when the state appears and intervenes, what it is doing is interfering with property rights. And by interfering with the right to property, the signal starts to get noisy, and the more intervention there is, the more the right to property is violated, and the signal that is transmitted becomes worse and worse and in the limit. In real socialism and without private property, there is no price system, and therefore the system collapses. That is why, in all the places where socialism was applied, it was a failure in the economic, social and cultural aspects, and also because it exacerbates the violence of the politicians. They have ended up killing 150 million human beings. The other issue that is also very important, and that is part of these problems, which are generated with the presence of socialism and the intervention of the state, is that, in addition, an incompatibility of incentives is generated, because if you are going to be earning money and you strive to earn money, as Milton Friedman said, the social responsibility of the businessman is to earn money, because if he does so, he is a hero. Because basically what he is doing is generating goods of better quality, at a better price. Therefore, it is a creator of well-being. And if you intervene in with the argument of income distribution and inequality and that kind of issues, with which socialism attacks, the counterpart is that why am I going to force myself if they are going to take away the fruit of my work? And if I cannot appropriate the fruit of my work, then there is no point in working. Moreover, in fact, the presence of socialism aborts the discovery process. And that is not a minor issue. In fact, Hayek pointed out that the market is a discovery process. Hayek put this in terms of the discussion on income distribution, saying that there was no such thing as a cake, but that this cake was a cake that was being created, that was being discovered, as the market process took place. But this is very important because the interference of the state ends up breaking the discovery process, which is basically innovation. Let us suppose two individuals who are not connected, and one generates a product and has a waste. In fact, that waste would want to be removed, and would even be willing to pay for someone to take that waste. And it happens that, on the other side, there may be another individual who could use that waste as an input and would be willing to pay for it. But then a third individual appears who discovers a business opportunity, which is to buy from the first and sell to the second, and he does this because he is going to make a profit. And if that profit is actually solving the problem for two individuals, which is wonderful. Remember that the first was willing to pay as long as they take it, and the second was desperate to get it, to be able to carry out his project. So, this third individual, obviously, is going to do well because he is solving a problem. And if the state appears regulating it, what will happen is that it will interfere in that process, it will abort it, and if the state advances too much, it will even abort it directly. Therefore, we are all going to live much worse. Probably, the most emblematic case was, during the pandemic, with the masks. If they had left it to the free market, there would have been many more masks, more quickly and much cheaper. And the fact that the state got involved, the only thing it did was generate a big problem. Naturally, in economies that were not so intervened, it caused damage. In super-intervened economies, like the case of Argentina, it caused our country to have 130,000 deaths from COVID. When, if we had done things like a less mediocre country, we would have had 30,000 deaths. That is to say, that the state present The state intervention in Argentines cost us 100,000 lives in 1 year. That is to say, the state intervention, in the end, ends up being a murderous intervention, directly or indirectly. And this is important because this combination of the market as a discovery process, plus Locke's appropriation principle, which states that whoever discovers it, keeps it, is the basis of Israel Kirzner's thinking on these issues, where he shows the market as a discovery process and that if you intervene in it, for whatever reason, in general it is usually done for distribution reasons, what you are going to do is harm. I will present it to you in another case and I will not go into this further. But let's suppose that I have a general equilibrium system and that, initially, it is in equilibrium and that, suddenly, a problem appears, such as the pandemic, and then you have a drastic change in demand. This drastic change in demand will mean that some products will be in high demand and their price, naturally in the short term, will be very high. That price signal is precisely what will attract resources from places where resources should not be and go to where people are asking for resources. If you start to intervene in that market in order to talk about income distribution, profits, inequality and so on, the only thing you will have is that the market, which had to be destroyed, is destroyed, but the market that should prosper does not prosper and, therefore, in the end we are all much worse off. Therefore, one of the things that is very important to keep in mind is that state intervention is always bad, because it is based on force. And nothing that is based on force can be good. In fact, liberalism is built on respect, the right to life, liberty, property, and always as a starting point and basis the principle of non-aggression. And if there is a large and institutionalized aggressor, it is the state. Therefore, the action of the state always produces harm, and the more state there is, the worse it is for us. In this logic, then, where intervention causes harm, this is tremendous because the neoclassical analytical instrument, even with people who feel libertarian, could end up being functional to socialism if it embraces the models and takes into account what is called market failures. Since the definition of market failure enables, supposedly, an intervention, I want to make some reflections here because one of the things that one notices and when one works in the business world that is, one uses models. Why? Because reality is complex, so one uses them to simplify, to be able to better understand what one is doing, to focus on the things that are truly important. But when the model does not map to reality, one throws away the model. That is, one does not get angry with reality. If you in a company get angry with reality and remain attached to the model, you will lose your jobs because you will be losing a lot of money. So, the first thing you learn when you are in the trenches is to understand that if the model does not map with reality, the model flies. However, in the neoclassical world, when reality does not map with the model, we call it market failure. That is, I would tell you that we are sick with fatal arrogance. And I include myself, I say, because I have taught microeconomics for 25 years of my life and I have read every microeconomics book that was around, I read every new model and paper that came out. But everything changed the day I read Murray Newton Rothbard in a work called Monopoly and Competition, and that day my life changed. But then what I want to say is that enabling that concept of market failure and intervention only favors socialism. That is, we end up being functional to socialism. In fact, within the framework of the strategy of socialism of the 21st century, and the way of advancing economies, and where Latin America is a great example. 21st century socialism has been very successful in Latin America. It has had a lot of presidents. And in Argentina it had 4 Kirchnerist periods, in Uruguay it had Pepe Mujica, it had Tabaré Vázquez, in Chile it had Lago, Bachelet, twice, Boric. Now in Paraguay, they have had Lugo. In Brazil they have had 2 Lula governments, one of Dilma Rousseff, then Lula again. They have Petro in Colombia. They have Castillo, who was in Peru. López Obrador in Mexico, and I don't think I'm forgetting any of them. And then, in Spain, they have Pedro Sánchez, who is something like a Kirchnerist, and I wouldn't say he has good manners because he doesn't have them. So, what do we do? One of the things I am going to do is detect these problems and propose some solutions. But, naturally, I want to let you know that this is part of my next work, which I am writing with Dr. Damian Rydell, with whom I also have the privilege of having him accompany me and who is one of my chief advisors, but I am going to be giving some clues as to where I think the solution lies. So the first thing is to define what a market is. In other words, it seems fundamental to me. And sometimes I have the feeling that many economists do not know how to define what a market is. In fact, some reflections that are made confirm to me that they do not know what the market is. And for me the market, again, is my definition, that is, what I think is, absolutely, under discussion. I do not have any kind of problem with that, and it is that the market is a process of social cooperation, where property rights are exchanged voluntarily. That is, you exchange property rights with another individual, with another agent, voluntarily. And if you do it voluntarily, there can be no error by definition, you are doing it voluntarily. That does not mean that you suppose that I go and buy a pair of shoes. And I thought that the pair of shoes would give me a certain benefit and I don't like it. Well, I was wrong. But I fix it. But there was no mistake in that decision. That is, at that moment when I made the decision, it was what I wanted to do, and I did it voluntarily. Nobody forced me to make that transaction. And the only agent within the economy that makes these forced transactions is the state. Therefore, the only one that can generate errors within the economy is the state. No, the market. Because in fact the market is ourselves. If when they talk about the market we are the market, we are the market. And then, Why do we have to put up with someone, fatally arrogant, coming to say that I am making the wrong decision, if they don't even know what I am doing, or why I am doing it? I mean, surely, if I were to see the Los Angeles Lakers, surely, a Boston Sale fan would say that I am wrong. If I like the Los Angeles Lakers, I saw Magic Johnson play. What are they trying to explain to me? That I am wrong. I like the colors yellow and purple. Besides, purple is the color of freedom advances, so I like it even more. This is very interesting. This happens to me regularly in public discussion. Some problem appears and some statist tells me, there is Milei's world that generates these problems. Then I say, okay, let's see if Milei's world generates these problems. I mean, besides how powerful I am that I am generating problems myself. So, nothing. I say because there are things that go through my head that obviously I cannot tell because I have a restriction that I am still head of state. So when you hear or when you see that I do something like a silence, I ask you please to understand me. So one of the things I say is if you believe that there is a market failure in a certain market, the first test I propose is to check if there is no state intervention because it is not the case that what you are perceiving as a market failure is actually precisely the damage caused by the action of the state, and if you were to remove the state from the middle we would surely be better off. So, the first point is go and check if the state is involved. Now, if you saw, went, checked and the state is not involved, I make a suggestion. Go and do the analysis again because it is wrong. I mean, obviously, I say, I am a libertarian liberal. Nothing. What I am going to give is the basis for why I say what I say. So, well, the question is, what motivated me all this? One of the things that happened to me in economics, from doing so much microeconomics and general equilibrium, was that when all the modern literature on economic growth appeared, it seemed very friendly to me. Now, it seemed so easy to me to the point that I started studying economic growth and ended up specializing in economic growth issues with and without money. Something that is also motivated by the fact that the most important economist in Argentine history, Miguel Sidriuski, was a specialist in economic growth with money. So I already had a certain attraction to that, and the micro foundations had been very useful to me, and having also given classes in mathematical economics also helped me. So I started to work on these issues. At one point I was invited to give a talk at the World Economic Forum, not the last one that made such a fuss, when I was a calmer person. I was invited to talk about demographics and growth, and when I started looking at this I came across the work of Angus Maddison, and I came across something that you all know. I'm going to describe it too, but surely you all know it, which is what is called the hockey stick. That is, that series that Maddison presents with 2,000 years of history, that is, from the year 0 of the Christian era until the year 2000, and we find that the GDP per capita for 1800 years was practically constant. that there was only a 40% increase in the GDP per capita in what has to do with the 16th century, that is. After the discovery of America, and that the truth is that it was an absolutely monotonous series, a series that if one separated back in 1800 and had to choose between staying with Smith or Malthus, it seemed the most reasonable to stay with Malthus. However, after the Industrial Revolution, GDP per capita rose nearly tenfold. And this occurred in a context where the population multiplied at least sevenfold. So, faced with this situation, what we see is that we are faced with the presence of increasing returns. We have more people entering the market, and yet productivity rises. If GDP per capita rose, that is, what Malthus predicted did not occur. The presence of increasing returns, that is, what in the terminology of market failure is called non-convexities, or if you want to put it another way, that there are concentrated market structures. The problem is that if you put it in microeconomic terms, that is a supposed market failure, or to put it in some way, monopolies are bad. So, if monopolies are bad or concentrated market structures are bad, how can we say that it is bad if in 1800 more than 95% of the population lived below the extreme poverty line, and in 2000 that number had fallen to less than 10%? That is to say, something that generated so much well-being, or that generated so much well-being from the perspective of microeconomics, was wrong. There are several answers. The easiest, simplest, most obvious answer, one could find it in a very nice book, a small book, a popular book. What's more, in the latest Spanish edition it has a prologue of mine and my conflict with the book when I found it. That must be why I dedicated myself to politics, because I love conflict. But, aside from the humor, there is a book by Henry Hazlitt called Economics in One Lesson, and he starts off and says, well, what is the lesson of economics? He stands between the bad economist and the good economist. He says that the bad economist is the one who focuses only on one market in a single period of time, while the good economist does not only look at one market, but looks at all the others, and not only considers the consequences of what happens today, but also considers the implications for the future. That is, he is talking about an economist. A bad economist is an economist who only does partial and single period equilibrium, and a good economist is general intertemporal equilibrium. That would be the definition. But I say, aside from this, the most important thing is how do we track the problem? Where is the problem? So now I am going to spoil the answer, and then I will give the explanations. From my point of view, the origin of the problem is in the interpretation of the invisible hand, of the idea of the invisible hand under Pareto logic, which makes the invisible hand incompatible with the idea of the pin factory, that is, increasing returns, and when one advances in the formal structuring of the efficiency analysis, right? choosing certain mathematical constructions brings the invisible hand into conflict with the pin factory. That has clear analytical consequences, and from that construction, when we introduce normative questions within the equilibrium analysis, is where this conflict between reality and the model that we call market failures begins to appear. When the problem of non-convexities appears, it has to do with concentrated market structures with monopolies. We can have the case of public goods. There is something very funny about public goods. We tend to discuss in terms of public goods in terms of rivalry in consumption and exclusion. When one looks then, for example, at the emblematic case that was used to describe a case where rivalry in consumption was not fulfilled and exclusion was the issue of the lighthouses. In one of those meetings that Milton Friedman and other economists had in Chicago, a lawyer used to participate who obviously was not contaminated with all the neoclassical tools that we basic economists are contaminated with, so he found very funny solutions. They said that the emblematic case was the failures. This lawyer, who later won the Nobel Prize in Economics and who lived to be 104 years old, if I'm not mistaken, whose name was Ronald Coase. What did he do? He went and analyzed all the failures of the 19th century. An emblematic case of market failure, and it was the case of public goods and there the intervention of the state and whatever was required. Well, guess what he discovered? They were all private. That is to say, that economists do not know how to describe the problem well. The problem is not in reality, it is in that we have tools that are wrong. This is an issue, that of public goods. I am going to do it for you now, and I think that when I tell you about it you will think that this is a joke. But believe me, in real life it is not, and much less in Argentina. It may be that I am affected by the case, but let us suppose that you have two communities separated by a river and you discover that if you build a bridge you could trade with the other community. You are expanding the market, therefore, you will have a greater division of labor, greater productivity, greater well-being. Sorry, do you have a Boca shirt there? Well, that is populism. No. But that was when I was a goalkeeper, it doesn't count, but doubly populist. Well, they discover that it would be good to build a bridge. What would happen? If it were only a problem for the private sector, do you know what they do? They get together and build the bridge, they look for a way around it. The problem is when the state is there, then the state goes, collects taxes from everyone and builds the bridge. But then there are a lot of people who live off the state. So, what do? They start looking, they create the Ministry of the Bridge and they start looking for where to build bridges. There comes a time when they have built all the bridges that could be built, so they create the Ministry of Water to supply water and then build a bridge. You laugh. I ask you to review the organizational chart of the public service. Luckily, here I have with me this formidable, wonderful professional, who is my Minister of Economy, Luis Caputo, who is the one who is carrying out the chainsaw, and we are getting a lot of things out of it. I want to tell you that it makes me very happy when they applaud my Minister of Economy because he is not only making the largest adjustment in Argentine history, but it is the largest in the history of humanity, in depth and in amount of time. When you put together what we are doing in the Treasury and in the central bank, in fact, we have adjusted more than 13 points of GDP. If you had mentioned that at another time, they would have crucified us both in the middle of 9 de Julio, which is where there is an obelisk, a tall and large thing there. I put it in the presentations and they applaud it. It is a change of era. People are awakening. They are awakening to the ideas of freedom, and the man who is carrying it out is the dear Luis Caputo, who is here present. Thank you. Obviously, there is another type of supposed market failure, and we could analyze it, the externalities. You take the case of externalities. The externalities in consumption are to avoid that point, so that there is no problem of circularity in the resolution of the equilibrium of the general problem. But you believe that people are so stupid that they will not be able to decide. There will come a time when they will die of hunger, so they will decide in some way so as not to die. That is to say, then I do not need someone to intervene to resolve the externality of consumption, because in the end someone will resolve it. The cases of externality in production. How many times have you seen in the textbooks about the company that pollutes the sea or the water? It is actually a problem of defining property. In fact, one of the brilliant things that Coase also solved was the issue of solving these problems by assigning property rights. Another issue is that of asymmetric information, where it is obviously clear that it is better not to involve the state because we can solve that problem better from the trenches than someone who is going to look at it from Everest. The other thing that is also extremely arrogant is the issue of the coordination failure as a consequence of a prisoner's dilemma problem. If you noticed, there is a strong assumption in the prisoner's dilemma: prisoners cannot interact. You realize that this simple assumption has a level of gross institutional violence, and then, as I take and introduce that level of gross institutional violence, now I need a violent organism to solve the coordination problem, as if the agents were idiots and the agents are not idiots. They are intelligent. The problem is that there are a lot of satraps in the middle called the state who live off our money, and that is why they create these problems. Why? So that they can live off of it and not so that we are better off. That is to say, they create their own demand. Why? Because they have the coercive power of the state in the middle. That is to say, the guy who is in the state determines what he can regulate. One of the things that will happen to them with the regulators, and it is important that they keep this in mind, is that, since they are in that office and need to justify why they are warming the seat, they create regulations to justify their existence, and they ruin all of our lives. It is not minor because it has direct implications on how this negatively impacts innovation. For example, well, they regulate because they do not know. They regulate because they have to warm the seat. They regulate for whatever reason, and they are ruining our lives. I'll tell you more. When you have monopolies, and this is important because we already know that we are going to have to explain growth in terms of increasing returns. When you start to regulate and look at any regulation model, one of the things that happens is that when you regulate, given the regulatory framework that implies the competitive model, you regulate those monopolies so that they look as much like the competitive model as possible, and if if you don't achieve this, well, they look like the second best solution, which is the Ramsey solution. In that context, what that regulation is going to do is eliminate quasi-rent, and if you eliminate quasi-rent, you are eliminating the incentives to innovate, and if you regulate by assimilating competitive companies and take away quasi-rent, what you are doing is killing innovation, and therefore you are killing economic growth. So, when you start regulating, what will be the flip side? You will not grow. What is the region of the world that is growing the least? Out of all proportion, Europe. And why? Because they are saturated with regulation, they became so fanatic about generating a model that resembles the competitive model that they killed increasing returns. In other words, they killed quasi-rents. By killing quasi-rents, they have no incentive to invest. If they do not invest, there is no innovation, therefore they are left without economic growth. So let us not allow these fatally arrogant people to destroy our lives with regulations. Let us go to a much freer society, and if the problem is economic theory, trying to see where the error of economic theory is, let the world resemble an economic theory that has errors that came from a world that had no growth. The Edwards box can be very funny when there is no growth in a static economy, just like Malthus, just like increasing marginal returns, but that is not the real world. What do? Do I stick with the model or do I stick with reality? Because reality makes me uncomfortable, I stick with the model and say that the problem is reality. Let's not fall into that madness, because in that madness we are going to destroy our lives. Well, what do we do now? Where do we go? One of the things I did was say, I'm not going to tell the whole story because I don't have the time, and well, having studied the history of economic thought has some advantages, like knowing where to make the cut, right? I said, let's go to Adam Smith. Let's start with Adam Smith. Although you are probably aware that I am a libertarian liberal, I adhere to the Austrian School of Economics. That I am actually philosophically an anarcho-capitalist, and that in real life I am a minarchist. Unlike my colleagues, I do not have a negative view of Adam Smith. In fact, Adam Smith seems to me to be a kind of total genius. For me, Adam Smith is to economics what Gauss was to mathematics. That is, someone who was 200 years ahead of his time and was the one who saw it. As we have a very particular way of doing politics, traditional analysts question us and we mock that and tell them, you don't see it. Well, Adam Smith saw it. In that sense, basically. From my interpretation of Adam Smith, the wonderful thing about Adam Smith is that he had an implicit model of economic growth. Adam Smith's model in An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of Wealth of Nations, for Friends, The Wealth of Nations is a model of economic growth. In fact, the idea of the pin factory is the idea of increasing returns, because I said, if I have one person making pins, one person alone, even if he were very good, what would he be able to produce? 20 units and no more than that. Now, what he was saying is that, when he divided the work into 15 different activities, the production of pins per capita jumped to 5,000. That is, you had increased the plant 15 times, in terms of personnel, and production had gone from 20 to 5,000 per capita. Then he says something that is very interesting, and that in light of what has been woven and carved regarding the interpretations of the future, especially the wonder that artificial intelligence implies, which is the exacerbation of increasing returns, especially for those dystopian equilibria.
Sobre todo para aquellos equilibrios distópicos, yo les diría no le tengan tanto miedo a los equilibrios distópicos.
I would tell them not to be so afraid of dystopian equilibriums because the idea of the pin factory and increasing returns and the division of labor has a limit.
Y la división del trabajo tiene un límite. ¿Y el límite cuál es?
And what is the limit? The size of the market. I am not going to hire 15 employees at the pin factory and then I would have 50,000, 75,000 pins to sell. If I cannot sell them, I am not going to go to that level of division of labor. I am going to go to the level that the market supports. Do not think of the process only from the supply side, think that there is also demand. Let us not fall into the problems that we fell into in the past with the hatred of the machine, that is, with the Luddites. Because, let's see, the day that Edison invented the light bulb, of course. The candle makers were very angry. They were very angry, and so, the reality is that what Edison did was wonderful, right? Because that allowed me to have a better quality good, at a better price. It reached more people, it also generated more work, and I also saved money and I was able to spend it on other goods. In other words, a machine for generating well-being. In other words, those who generate technological progress are machines for generating well-being, but they can never go beyond the limits of the market, unless there is innovation that makes us all richer. That makes us all better off. So, let us not be afraid. Let us not ask for regulations because we do not understand what it is about. Let us try to understand what it is about and not to regulate. That is to say, freedom can never be bad. What is bad is not being free. Innovation is never bad, ultimately. We can discuss the values on which innovation is built, and if we build them on the values of libertarianism, I say, who could be against unrestricted respect for the life project of others or in defense of the right to life, liberty, property based on the principle of non-aggression? What is the problem with this? Who is against this? Only you could be successful by serving your neighbor with better quality, at a better price. But there is a limit. The limit is the size of the market. Do not be afraid. Do not regulate technological progress, this will have demand as a counterpart. Or do you think that you are going to generate technological progress for things that do not exist? How are they going to do such a crazy thing and sink a lot of money into it? If that money really comes from human beings, are they going to throw money away just to throw money away? I don't know any businessmen who dedicate themselves to burning money for sport. The other thing that is also very interesting about Adam Smith's work is that he contemplated learning in practice. That is, the model of work, and he also contemplated technological progress. Because basically what Adam Smith said was that a person in his work, each time he did it more times, he did it better and better. That is, at some point he found ways to produce the same but using less work and he reached a discrete leap. We call that discrete leap technological progress. That is, Adam Smith not only had increasing returns contemplated, he had the problem of the division of labor well defined, but he also had a growth model that contemplated technological progress. All in the year 1776, and it also took him 10 years to write the book. If that is not being advanced, I don't know what is being advanced. And the other thing that was interesting was free markets and minimal government intervention. And the corollary of that is the invisible hand. That each person, guided by his own self-interest, leads to the general welfare. On the monetary level, Adam Smith had a model of the gold standard. Now, once you have Adam Smith's work, it's clear that today it's easy, knowing the results, to know that Adam Smith was right. But at that time it wasn't so obvious. Standing in 1776, it wasn't so obvious. And that's why you have to say that in 1801, if I'm not mistaken. But that's where Malthus' work and the idea of diminishing marginal returns came in. It didn't seem crazy in light of what had been, say, the previous 1800 years. And furthermore, before the year zero it was not very different from what it was afterwards until 1800, and that made sense because it said that when someone arrived, he occupied the best plot of land, and when the second arrived, he occupied a smaller one, and so on. So marginal productivity was decreasing, right? That made real wages increasingly smaller, and that later interacted with the passion for the sexes, led to the iron law of wages, and led to a lot of aberrant relationships that we are not going to discuss now. But aberrant relationships that had already been in place for many years. It is not the focus of the discussion at this time to go there. That idea was continued by Ricardo, by Stuart Mill, until it reached Marx. The reality is that at that moment is when the neoclassical theory appears, surpassing the classics with the subjective theory of value. There is Menger on one side and Leon Walra. I mention them because it is important, since at some point economic theory will have to go back in time, after Keynes. And that provided a relevant basis from which to draw. In that sense, when we are entering the 20th century, it begins to become evident that Malthus' analysis was wrong. That what Adam Smith had proposed was right, that there was the problem of increasing returns, and that if one wanted to explain economic growth with constant returns to scale and with the neoclassical tool, it did not work in that format, and much less with decreasing marginal returns. The first two who saw this were Alfred Marshall and Alan Young, and they began to see how they could put the question of increasing returns into the structure of the models in order to explain economic growth. This debate was so important and so intense that it is when you start to discuss monopoly, and you will find there the theory of monopoly, like that of Joan Robinson, or very interesting models like that of Chamberlain with monopolistic competition. That is to say, there was a whole climate at the time to try to see where the problem of increasing returns was and how to put them into what today we would call macroeconomic analysis or economic growth to explain economic growth. There was a specific problem. But Keynes appeared, and the problem with the appearance of Keynes is that the entire analytical framework that existed before was destroyed. That is to say, the general theory is a masterpiece, but a masterpiece of evil, of terror. I don't want to start talking about Keynes, because if I do this I will spend 7 hours, and I have a lot of meetings that I will not get to. How did pre-Keynesian macroeconomic analysis work? I mean, it wasn't called macroeconomics, but it doesn't matter. Today we can think of it that way.
No importa. Hoy lo podemos pensar así. Eran lo que se llamaban los modelos a la Bixel.
They were what were called intertemporal models, where the interaction between savings and investment determined the interest rate, which is called the Wixelian interest rate, that is. The interest rate being an intertemporal coordination mechanism that is nothing more or less than the relative price of present goods with respect to future goods, and the price level was determined in the money market. In other words, it was a model with intertemporal characteristics where relative prices were determined in the goods market and, in intertemporal terms, savings and investment determined the interest rate, and that had to have all the relative prices aligned in terms of goods so that everything coincided, that they had the same interest rate, so that there was no intertemporal arbitrage. What Keynes did there was to break everything. The first thing he did was to create a consumption function depending on income, which in terms of those who understand general equilibrium is an aberration. General equilibrium functions do not consider quantities, they consider all prices. In fact, a general equilibrium model is determined by preferences, endowments, and technology. If you take out the excess demand functions that depend on prices, there is no income, it does not appear there. Income is derived from selling my endowments and from the share I have in the benefits. Prices contain all the information. But since Keynes was not an economist and had only taken a course with Marshall, who was the champion of partial equilibrium, he came up with the idea of including income in the consumption function and broke the intertemporality of consumption. Therefore, savings became a residue after investment. The general theory is interesting because it has a beautiful chapter describing what investment criteria are, and in the other it says that basically animal spirits determine investment. I have more crude versions, but I cannot say them as head of state. In the goods market, instead of determining the interest rate, he goes on to determine income. And with that income he determines the demand for labor, which, in the face of a labor supply, determines the wage. This has several problems because he fails to determine the price level and the interest rate. He decides to determine the interest rate in the money market, which is crazy because the interest rate exists not because money exists, but because time exists. Also, how can there be an interest rate in a single period model? It makes no sense. The interest rate is an essentially intertemporal matter. Therefore, he obviously had no theory of capital or anything like that. What did he do? Well, he determined that the price level of the economy was a markup on wages, that is, another aberration. He destroyed the entire theory of value. Obviously, such a monster could not work, and then, when it became clear that Keynesian theory did not work, it manifested itself with the acceleration of inflation. What happened then? The multiplier implied a violation of the budget constraint. They said, hey, we went overboard, let's go back to basics. But since the Austrian school had been defeated in that historical context, they decided to go back to Walras line. And they leveraged the work of Abraham Wald, a young mathematician who in the 1920s made a demonstration of the existence of equilibrium without having fixed point theorems, a true genius. And with the arrival of Brouwer's fixed-point theorems in 1956 and Kakutani's in 1957, the first for functions and the second for correspondences, we began to work on the analysis of general equilibrium. In general equilibrium, we basically study whether the equilibrium exists, whether it is unique, and whether it is stable. The wonder of the fixed-point theorems is that if we are working with sets that are closed, bounded, convex, and with continuous functions, we can apply Brouwer's theorem. Then the equilibrium will exist, it will be unique and stable. In the case of correspondences, the equilibrium will exist, we do not know if it is unique, but if we make some additional assumptions, either on the demand or supply side or both, we can ensure uniqueness and stability. The problem appears when we want to introduce the Pareto optimum, that is, add welfare properties to the equilibrium that we now know exists, is unique and is stable. The idea is that if each one guided by his own interest, called maximizes his utility, leads to maximum general welfare, and we would need that all agents would be maximizing. But when we put it in terms of consumer, there is no problem. The problem appears on the side of the firm. One of the problems is that they cannot accept increasing returns because in that case the production functions would be convex functions and they could not find a maximum unless they found it on an edge, which would imply that they keep the entire economy. When they look and there are several companies, it means that it is not a problem. In an economy with only one agent, that happened in communism, and we already know that it was a failure because it could not compute prices, therefore, it does not work. So, it was decided to look the other way and leave it like that. In Varian's book, which is surely the best at an intermediate level, do you know how many times the word entrepreneur is mentioned in the book? None. And company? 4 times. Firm? Yes. That is to say, do you think that the function of the entrepreneur is only to solve a Lagrangian? The work of the entrepreneur would be quite easy, and that was lost here. Which prevents us from correctly capturing the problem of increasing returns. That problem of wanting to do welfare analysis led to using bad mathematical constructions that leave us with constant returns to scale or diminishing marginal returns. If there is something that reality differs from the model, we call it market failure, and that enables intervention. When we enable intervention, the result is worse. The more we advance with the issue of regulations, the more we will be killing increasing returns, the generation of benefits and incentives to innovate. If we kill incentives to innovate, we will not grow anymore. I suggest actively reading a work by Murray Newton Rothbard, the inventor of anarcho-capitalism, called Monopoly and Competition within the book, Man, Economy and the State. The third volume is called Power and Market, but it is part of the same work where Rothbard becomes anarcho-capitalist. This will open your eyes and you will see that monopolies are not bad. If I have 10 companies and one creates a product, like a better quality cell phone at a better price, the other 9 go bankrupt. But that businessman is a social benefactor because he is giving me a better quality good at a better price, which allows me to consume other goods and save money, that is. He is making my life easier. It doesn't matter if he saves it or reinvests it in his company, because that will generate better products and salaries, save me more money and do a lot of other things. Great, what's the problem? Look, this guy is so bad, so villainous that you know what he does. All the money he earns he buries in the ground. Well, if he did that, he is taking money out of the economy and therefore the price level is lower, and that is what we all want. So by lowering prices, let's not be afraid, let's move forward, let's be optimistic. We don't know what the future will be like. The only thing we know is that it will be much better, and it will be much better if we take the state out of our entire lives in the middle of it. Thank you very much.